Fate isn't a straight line, it's a ricochet, a stray bullet that misses its intended mark and finds a new home in the architecture of someone else's life. They tell you violence is a transaction, a simple exchange of force for a desired outcome. They're wrong. Violence is a seed. Once planted, you can never be sure what will grow or whose garden it will choke. Tonight, a debt would be created in blood and paid for with a soul, and the currency would be a choice made in the space between one breath and the next. A choice that would prove that the most dangerous thing in a world of monsters isn't the man with a gun, but the woman with nothing left to lose. Rewind 5 hours earlier, the rain didn't just fall on the city. It bled down the plate glass windows of La Luna, the restaurant so exclusive its air tasted like money. Outside, the world was a watercolor of blurred headlights and hunched shoulders. Inside, it was a warm, velvet-lined box of quiet confidence. For Ela, it was just Tuesday. It was the ache in her feet from shoes with soles worn thin as a promise. It was the crumpled eviction notice in her locker, its sharp edges a constant, nagging pressure against her ribs. At 21, she was an expert in the art of the invisible. She refilled water glasses with ghost-like efficiency, cleared plates with a silent grace, and offered a smile that never quite reached the weary exhaustion in her eyes. She was a moving part in a machine she could never afford to be a customer of, serving slivers of branzino that cost more than her weekly groceries to people who never bothered to learn her name. The clinking of silver on porcelain was the soundtrack to her anxiety, each chime a reminder of the cavernous distance between her world and theirs. Tonight, the air was different, thicker. A low hum of tension vibrated just beneath the surface of the polite murmurs and muted jazz. The staff moved with a clipped, nervous energy. Ela felt it like a change in atmospheric pressure, a storm gathering just offshore. She straightened her apron, the cheap fabric a stark contrast to the silk and cashmere drifting past her, and prepared to disappear again. But fate, that ricocheting bullet, was already in the air. It was looking for a target, and in a room full of power, it would find its mark in the one person who had none at all. She smoothed a non-existent wrinkle from a tablecloth, her reflection a fleeting, tired smudge in the polished silver. She had no idea the reflection, staring back, was of a woman whose life was about to be broken open, shattered, and remade in steel and shadow. The transaction was coming. The shift in the room was palpable. A silent, collective intake of breath. It wasn't loud. It was the opposite. A sudden, deferential quiet fell over the main dining floor as the doors opened. Two figures entered, moving through the space, not as guests, but as gravity itself, bending the light and sound around them. The man in front was Marco. He was carved from ice and ambition, his suit a razor-sharp silhouette of black wool that seemed to absorb the ambient light. His face was a study in controlled stillness, his eyes missing nothing, assessing every glance, every shadow, as if the world were a chessboard and he was already 5 moves ahead. Behind him, a mountain of a man named Enzo, his bodyguard, stood with the serene menace of a predator at rest. But it was the woman on Marco's arm who drew Ila's focus. She was older, her posture radiating a quiet, unshakable dignity. Signora Rossi. Her hair was a crown of elegant silver, and she wore a dress the color of a deep forest, its dark green silk shimmering as she moved. She was the calm at the center of her son's storm. Ila's manager, his face pale and slick with sweat, gestured frantically. "Table 7, that's you, Ila. Be perfect. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not make eye contact with him. Address only the mother." The instructions were whispered with the frantic terror of a man who understood the stakes. Ila's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage. She had seen men like him before, men who moved with a chilling certainty that the world belonged to them. They were a different species. She approached the table, her worn shoes silent on the plush carpet. "Good evening, Signora. May I offer you some water?" she asked, her voice steady, her eyes fixed respectfully on the elder woman. Signora Rossi offered a small, kind smile. "Thank you, dear." Her voice was soft, a stark contrast to the cold silence emanating from her son. Marco didn't look at Ela. He was scanning the room, his gaze lingering on the exits, the windows, the other patrons. He wasn't having dinner. He was occupying territory. Ela moved with practiced care, pouring the water, her hands steady despite the tremor deep inside her. She could feel his presence like a physical weight, a cold spot in the warm room. She saw the way other diners angled their bodies away, the way the staff gave the table a wide berth. This wasn't respect, it was fear, a deep, primal understanding that they were in the presence of apex power. Signora Rossi, however, seemed oblivious, or perhaps simply accustomed to, the invisible circle of dread that surrounded her family. She asked Isla a simple question about the menu, and for a fleeting moment it was just a conversation between two women, a brief, fragile pocket of normalcy in a room pregnant with unspoken danger. The meal progressed in a state of suspended tension. Each course was served and cleared in near silence, punctuated only by Signora Rossi's occasional soft-spoken compliments. Ela moved like a phantom, her focus narrowed to the table, to the simple, grounding tasks of her job. Yet, she couldn't ignore the details at the edge of her vision. The busboy clearing a nearby table wore a uniform that was just a little too new, a little too stiff. He avoided her gaze. A side door to the kitchens, usually propped open, was now firmly shut. Small things, wrong things. Marco noticed them too. His stillness had become absolute, his hand resting on the table just inches from his mother's. He was a coiled spring. The dessert course had just been served, a delicate pear tart for Signora Rossi. When the first sound came, not a bang, but a muffled, wet thump, like a heavy book falling on carpet. It was the sound of a silenced gunshot hitting the matron by the entrance. Then another. Chaos erupted. Screams tore through the polite ambiance. Patrons scrambled, overturning tables and chairs. Glass shattered, but Isla's world had shrunk to a single horrifying point of focus. Across the room, the new busboy was no longer a busboy. He held a pistol, its suppressor a dark, ugly snout, and he wasn't aiming at the formidable figure of Marco. His target was the old woman in the dark green dress. Time seemed to stretch and warp. Ela saw the shift in the gunman's stance, the cold, impersonal focus in his eyes. She saw Signora Rossi's look of frail confusion. She saw Marco moving, a blur of deadly grace. But he was a fraction of a second too late. There was no thought. There was no calculation of risk or reward. There was only a primal, overwhelming instinct, a deep, unbidden reflex to shield the vulnerable. In one explosive, desperate motion, Isla threw herself forward. She didn't push Signora Rossi out of the way. She became a wall. She covered the older woman's body with her own, her arms wrapped around her fragile shoulders, her back to the threat. The world exploded in a starburst of white-hot agony. The impact felt less like a piercing and more like a brutal punch from a fist of molten steel slamming into her back just below her shoulder blade. The force stole her breath, driving the air from her lungs in a choked gasp. The sound of the restaurant, the screams, the chaos, all faded into a deafening, distant roar. As her knees buckled and the plush carpet rushed up to meet her, the last thing she saw was Marco's face. The mask of icy control was shattered, and in its place was a raw, blazing expression of shock and something else, something terrifyingly complex as he stared at the nobody waitress bleeding out to save his mother. Consciousness returned not as a gentle dawn, but as a sharp, unwelcome intrusion. The first thing she registered was the pain, a deep, throbbing fire in her back, tamed but not extinguished by whatever drug was dripping into her veins. The second was the silence. It was a heavy, sterile silence, broken only by the quiet, rhythmic beep of a heart monitor. This wasn't a hospital. Hospital rooms smelled of antiseptic and quiet suffering. This room smelled of nothing, which was somehow more unnerving. It was all white walls, brushed steel, and a single floor-to-ceiling window showcasing a dizzying panorama of the city's glittering skyline. She was on a bed with sheets so fine they felt like cool water against her skin. A silk prison. A man in a doctor's coat was checking the IV drip, his movements efficient and impersonal. He didn't speak to her. When he was done, he simply nodded toward the corner of the room and left. That's when she saw him. Marco was sitting in a minimalist black leather chair, watching her. He hadn't moved. He was as still as a statue, his dark suit immaculate, betraying nothing of the chaos from hours before. The mountain Enzo stood sentinel by the door. "You're awake," Marco stated. It wasn't a question. His voice was flat, cold, devoid of gratitude or concern. It was the voice of a man examining a puzzle piece that didn't fit. "The doctor said the bullet passed clean through. It missed your spine by less than an inch. You'll recover." He delivered the news like a weather report. Isla tried to push herself up, but a fresh wave of pain seared through her back and she fell back against the pillows with a gasp. His eyes narrowed. Why? The single word hung in the air, sharp and heavy as a blade. Isla swallowed, her throat dry. "What?" "Don't play games with me," he said, his voice dropping lower, each syllable laced with menace. "Nobody does something like that for nothing. Who sent you? Who are you working for? Was this a play to get inside? To earn my trust?" The accusations were a volley of ice-cold stone. He saw conspiracy and betrayal in an act of simple, stupid courage. Anger, hot and sharp, cut through her pain and fear. "Are you serious?" she whispered, her voice raspy. "I work for La Luna. I make $12 an hour plus tips. The only person I'm working for is my landlord." A flicker of something, disbelief, maybe even frustration, crossed his face. "Altruism doesn't exist in my world. People are motivated by greed or fear. So I ask you again, why did you shield my mother?" He leaned forward, his gaze pinning her to the bed. She met it, her own eye blazing with a defiant fire she didn't know she possessed. Because he was going to shoot her. Because she's an old woman. Because it was the right thing to do. "You monster!" The last word slipped out raw and unfiltered. The room went dead, silent. Enzo shifted his weight. A subtle, dangerous movement. Marco's face became a mask of cold fury. He stood up, towering over her. For a terrifying moment, she thought he might strike her. Instead, he stared down at her, his expression unreadable, a storm of suspicion and a dawning, unwelcome complexity churning behind his eyes. "You are either the best operative I have ever seen," he said softly, his voice a silken threat, "or the biggest fool. Until I determine which, you are not going anywhere." The sterile medical room was replaced by a cage of breathtaking luxury. Marco had her moved to a sprawling penthouse apartment in a building that scraped the clouds. The place was a monument to minimalist wealth, all glass, chrome, and stark white furniture. The view was spectacular, a god's-eye perspective of the city she used to scurry through far below. But the floor-to-ceiling windows felt like the bars of a cell. She was a prisoner of his gratitude, or, more accurately, his suspicion. Enzo was her warden, a silent, ever-present shadow stationed in the hallway, outside her door. Her meals appeared on a cart, gourmet dishes she would have served but never dreamed of eating. A private nurse changed her bandages daily. Her every need was met except the one she craved most: freedom. The days bled into one another, a blur of managed pain, forced rest, and a growing, suffocating sense of dislocation. She was living in a world she didn't belong to. a ghost haunting a life that wasn't hers. On the third day, she had another visitor. Signora Rossi entered the apartment, not with the force of her son, but with a quiet, unassuming grace. She dismissed the nurse with a gentle wave of her hand and sat in a chair beside Isla's bed. She held a small, simply wrapped box in her lap. "I wanted to thank you properly," Signora Rossi said, her voice filled with a sincere warmth that felt like the first ray of sun after a long winter. "My son, he lives in a world of sharp edges. He does not always know how to express gratitude." She opened the box. Inside, nestled on a bed of silk, was a small, intricately carved jade pendant of a hummingbird. "My mother gave this to me. It is a symbol of resilience, of finding sweetness in difficult places." She placed it gently in Isla's hand. The stone was cool and smooth. "You saved my life, child. That is a debt our family can never truly repay." Isla could only shake her head, overwhelmed. "I just reacted." "A person's true nature is revealed in their reactions," Signora Rossi said, her eyes knowing and kind. Just then, Marco entered the room. He stopped when he saw his mother with his expression hardening slightly. "Mama," he said, the Italian word for mother soft on his lips. "You should be resting." "I am fine, Marco," she replied, her tone gentle but firm, carrying an authority that even he could not challenge. She turned her gaze from Isla to her son. "This girl has a good soul. She is brave and she is kind. You will protect her. You will keep her safe." This is not a request. The command was absolute. Marco's jaw tightened, but he gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. He looked at Isla, and for the first time the cold calculation in his eyes was tempered by something else. The weight of his mother's decree, the undeniable reality of the debt. He might not trust her, he might not understand her, but he was now bound to her by an obligation sealed in blood and maternal law. As Isla's body healed, the penthouse began to feel less like a prison and more like a strange, suspended reality. The forced proximity with her protector settled into a tense, unspoken rhythm. Marco began to visit more frequently. His interrogation softened, morphing into something more like cautious observation. He would sit in the armchair across the room, nursing a glass of whiskey, and simply watch her as she sketched in a notebook a nurse had brought her. The silence between them was a living thing, filled with questions and assumptions. One evening she broke it. "Does it ever get quiet?" she asked, not looking up from her drawing. He raised an eyebrow. "The city?" "No," she said, finally meeting his gaze. "In your head?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. He was silent for a long moment, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "Quiet is a luxury," he finally answered, his voice low. "It's what my enemies use to plan." "Must be loud," she murmured, a hint of dry wit in her tone. To her astonishment, the corner of his mouth twitched, the barest ghost of a smile. It was a crack in the ice, a fleeting glimpse of the man beneath the monster. Their strange dynamic was interrupted by the arrival of Dante. He was Marco's second-in-command, a man who wore his ambition as elegantly as he wore his tailored suits. He arrived bearing an extravagant bouquet of flowers, his smile polished to a high sheen. "Ila," he said, his voice smooth as velvet. "Marco has told me all about your incredible bravery. The entire organization is in your debt." He used a charm that felt slick and manufactured. While he spoke of gratitude, his eyes were cold and assessing, cataloging her, the room, her proximity to Marco. He asked her questions about her recovery, about her family, about her life before the shooting. It felt less like concern and more like intelligence gathering. "Marco can be intense," Dante said, leaning in conspiratorially. "But he has a good heart. He feels this debt to you very deeply. We all do." Ila felt an instinctive chill. There was something predatory behind his polished manners, a hunger that he couldn't quite conceal. When he left, The room felt colder. "I don't like him," she said, plainly to Marco later that night. Marco looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "Dante is useful. He is smooth where I am sharp. He handles the politics. He looks at you like he's measuring you for a coffin," she retorted. Marco didn't laugh. He just gave her a long, searching look as if seeing a new, unexpected angle on a familiar board, a seed of doubt planted by the girl who saw the world in simple terms of right and wrong, good and bad. A girl who could spot a snake even when it was smiling. The outside world finally intruded in the form of a heavy, cream-colored invitation. The annual Carbone Foundation charity gala. It was a command performance for the city's elite, both legitimate and otherwise. A night where predators mingled under crystal chandeliers, their smiles as sharp and dangerous as the knives they kept hidden. "I have to go," Marco said, his voice tight with displeasure as he tossed the invitation onto a table. Maintaining the facade requires these performances. He had no intention of taking Ila. It was too public, too dangerous. But his mother had other ideas. Signora Rossi was adamant. "Ila will come with us," she announced during a visit. "She has been locked in this apartment for weeks. She needs air and she is family now. The person who saved my life will not hide in the shadows. She will sit at my side." Marco's protests were useless against his mother's quiet, unyielding will. And so Ila was drawn deeper into his world. A stylist appeared with a rack of designer gowns. Ila chose a simple, elegant dress of midnight blue silk that felt like a costume. As she looked at her reflection, she saw a stranger. The tired waitress was gone, replaced by a polished, poised woman who looked like she belonged in that world of wealth and power. It felt like a lie. The ballroom was a dazzling ocean of light and sound. The air hummed with whispered gossip and the clinking of champagne glasses. Ila clung to Signora Rossi's arm, feeling small and exposed. Marco was a different person here. He moved with a predatory grace, accepting greetings from politicians and judges with a smile that never reached his eyes. He was a king in his court, and Ila was the mysterious new addition to his inner circle. Whispers followed them. "Who is she? I've never seen her before." Marco leaned close to her, his breath warm against her ear, his hand resting possessively on the small of her back. "That man talking to the senator," he murmured, his voice a low rumble only she could hear. "He runs the waterfront. He would sell his own children for profit. The woman in red, she launders money through her art galleries. Don't be fooled by the diamonds. This is the most dangerous room in the city." He wasn't just making conversation. He was arming her. He was showing her the world as he saw it, a battlefield hidden beneath a veneer of civility. Dante was there, of course, ever the smooth operator, moving through the crowd, his hand on Marco's shoulder, whispering updates about security. "Everything is locked down tight," he assured them with a confident smile. "No one gets in or out without my say." So, the irony was a blade waiting to fall. As Ila watched Dante work the room, her earlier unease solidified into a cold certainty. He wasn't just managing security. He was mapping the exits. The trap was sprung with a calculated, theatrical flair. A fire alarm blared, its shriek cutting through the music and chatter. Panic, however, was slow to catch. Most guests assumed it was a drill, but Marco knew better. His body went rigid. "We're leaving now," he commanded, his voice a low, urgent growl. Enzo was already moving, creating a path. But Dante was there first, his expression a perfect mask of calm urgency. "This way," he directed, pointing toward a service corridor. "It's the most direct and secure exit. I have my men stationed there. They'll take you and your mother to the car. I'll handle the evacuation." It all happened too fast. Marco, focused on a potential threat from the front, hesitated for a split second. In that moment, Dante's men, disguised as hotel security, flanked Signora Rossi and Ila, ushering them toward the indicated corridor. Go with them, Isla, Marco ordered. Stay with my mother. It was a fatal miscalculation. As Isla and Signora Rossi were hustled down the sterile white hallway, the heavy fire door slammed shut behind them, the magnetic lock clicking into place with a sound of absolute finality. They were cut off. The security guards dropped their pretense, their faces turned hard, their hands reaching for weapons. At the other end of the hall, Dante appeared, a satisfied smirk on his face. "He's so predictable," Dante said, his voice dripping with contempt, always so focused on the enemy in front of him. He never sees the knife at his back. Signora Rossi looked at him, not with fear, but with a profound, weary disappointment. "You were like a son to me, Dante." "He was the son," Dante snarled, his composure cracking. "I was just the help. Tonight, that changes. The target was always you, old woman. Without you, his heart, he's just a rabid dog. Easy to put down." The men raised their guns, but Isla, once again, moved on instinct. She wasn't a fighter, but she was no longer just a victim. She grabbed a heavy-duty fire extinguisher from the wall mount. As the first man took aim, she yanked the pin and blasted a thick, choking cloud of white foam directly into his face. He staggered back, blind and sputtering. The momentary chaos was all the opening they needed. The lock on the fire door behind them exploded inward as Enzo and Marco burst through, their faces masks of cold, murderous rage. Marco's eyes locked on Dante, and in that instant, the entire power dynamic of the city shifted. The ensuing fight was brutal and short. While Enzo dealt with the guards with terrifying efficiency, Marco advanced on Dante, a force of nature. Isla shielding, Signora Rossi behind her watched the two men who were once like brothers collide in a flurry of violence. Dante was skilled, but Marco was fury incarnate. It ended with Dante on his knees, bloodied and beaten. "You let a waitress and an old woman make you weak," Dante spat, his last act of defiance. Marco's reply was not a word, but the cold, final sound of a single, deafening gunshot that echoed down the empty corridor. The ride back to the penthouse was a silent, grim procession. The adrenaline of the fight had evaporated, leaving behind the metallic taste of blood and betrayal. Signora Rossi was quiet, her regal composure finally cracking, revealing the frail, shaken woman beneath. Enzo drove, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Marco sat beside Isla in the back, not speaking, his presence a vortex of controlled violence. Back in the apartment, the silence stretched thick and suffocating. Signora Rossi retired to her room, escorted by a female attendant. Enzo took up his post outside, leaving Isla and Marco alone in the vast, sterile living room. The glittering city lights outside seemed to mock the grim reality within. Isla sank onto the sofa, a tremor running through her body. She noticed a long, bloody scrape on her forearm from where she'd been slammed against the wall. Before she could react, Marco was there. He knelt in front of her, a first aid kit in his hands. His movements were surprisingly gentle as he cleaned the wound, his touch light, almost hesitant. The brutal crime lord who had just executed his right-hand man without blinking was now tending to her like she was made of glass. "You shouldn't have been there," he said, his voice a low, rough rasp. He wasn't looking at her face, but at his work, his focus absolute. "If I hadn't been, your mother would be dead," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. Dante would have won. He stopped, his fingers hovering over her skin. He slowly lifted his head and his eyes met hers. The coldness was gone. In its place was something raw and unguarded, a potent mixture of guilt, fury, and a terrifying, unfamiliar tenderness. He saw her not as a puzzle or a debt, but as the one fixed point of honor in his collapsing world, the one person who acted not out of greed or fear, but out of a simple, incomprehensible goodness. "This world," he said, his voice thick with self-loathing. "It will devour someone like you. It will chew you up and spit you out. Maybe," she said, her voice growing stronger. "Or maybe I'm tougher than you think." He finished bandaging her arm, his touch lingering for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. He stood up, not as a crime boss, but as a man stripped down to his essential truths. "The debt I owe you is no longer just for my mother's life. It's for yours. You are mine to protect now." It wasn't a declaration of love in any conventional sense. It was a vow, a claim forged in gunfire and sealed in betrayal. It was his world's language for devotion. "You and my mother. That is the only law that matters to me now." Isla looked up at him, into the eyes of this dangerous, broken, and beautiful man. And for the first time since she'd been dragged into his orbit, she didn't feel like a prisoner. She felt safe. She simply nodded, accepting the weight of his promise. Weeks later, the storm had passed. The tremors from Dante's betrayal had shaken the city's underworld. But Marco had moved with ruthless speed to consolidate his power. The vacuum was filled. The traitors purged. A new, colder order had settled over the streets. For Isla, the world had been irrevocably altered. The penthouse was no longer a cage. It had become a sanctuary. The fear had receded, replaced by the quiet, steady rhythm of a new life. She no longer felt like an imposter. She was simply here. She spent her afternoon sketching, filling pages with the cityscapes visible from her window, finding a strange beauty in the sprawling metropolis that had almost killed her. One evening, Marco came home early. He wasn't wearing one of his immaculate, weaponized suits. He was in a simple gray sweater and dark pants, looking younger, less like a king, and more like a man carrying the weight of his kingdom. He looked tired, but the violent tension that always coiled in his shoulders was gone. He was at peace. He didn't speak, just walked over to the kitchen and prepared a pot of tea, the familiar domestic ritual, a quiet statement in itself. He brought 2 cups to the window where Isla was sitting, handing one to her. Their fingers brushed, a small spark of warmth in the cool air. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and violet. The city lights began to flicker on, a constellation of a million different lives, a million different stories spread out at their feet. "I never used to notice the sunset from up here," he said softly, his voice a low murmur against the glass. "I was always looking down, watching for threats." "What do you see now?" she asked. He turned, his head, his gaze leaving the view and settling on her. "I see a reason to look up. Fate isn't a straight line. It's a ricochet. Sometimes it tears through you, leaving a trail of destruction. But sometimes, if you're impossibly, terrifyingly lucky, it shatters the life you knew, only to deliver you exactly where you were always meant to be." In the quiet of the twilight, surrounded by the silent, glittering city, the monster and the angel had found their hard-won peace.